RackForms includes a lot of built-in JavaScript functionality, but there are going to be times when we want to incorporate some new functionality or widgets that aren't part of the core RackForms installation. And luckily, we actually have a way of doing that. There's a couple steps involved, but that's what we want to cover in this video. So first things first, we're usually going to have some kind of need to fulfill. And in this particular case, our example is we have the want to supply a birth date selector to our users where they don't have to do a bunch of clicking first, right? So usually we select a default value for a calendar, and even if you're 12 years old, that means 12 clicks to go back 12 years, and then it's kind of a hassle. So I did a little bit of searching on Google, and I found a really great date picker plugin. It's just called simply Date Picker, and it's got this really nice, unique way of doing it where I could just basically select my year from a really simple list, the month, and then the day. So very, very simple. So I want to include this in RackForms. So there's two main ways that we can do it. The first way is pretty simple in that we will literally just take whatever the plugin contents is, go to a download link, and we would then take whatever we get from that download, in this case, this stuff right here, and we go to our job folder as it sits in RackForms. So I would take whatever my RackForms installation is, I go to the output folder, then the forms folder, then whatever my job name is called, in this case, custom calendar, and then I would put the folder, the download, in the always saved folder right here. And what's going to happen then is every time I save my job in RackForms, all of the contents except for the always saved folder gets refreshed. So the library is saved, and we can use it. The problem with this is kind of a one-off solution, and this is actually a pretty handy calendar right here, so I always want this available. So there's actually a better way of doing it, which is we actually create this as an entry for our additional JavaScript libraries functionality. So in RackForms, it looks a little something like this. I select my page, and then under page JavaScript CSS code, I have this include additional JavaScript library block. And I can just then pick from any of the libraries that are in here. These libraries are what you customize. Now, RackForms ships with a bunch of default ones, but you can add your own at any time. And so that's specifically what we want to do right now. Now, I've already added the date picker library right here, but the way it works in the file system is actually pretty simple. I go to my RackForms installation, and under app move files, I'll find a folder called additional JS libs. And then I just simply create a folder for whatever item I want. In this case, again, I call it Date Picker. And then once again, I put the contents of whatever my zip folder is into that folder. So I just do that. And this will then create, just because I have this Date Picker folder, this will actually create now the entry in RackForms. And we can actually see that if I select this, we have like data tables in image preview. Those are just two folders in my additional JS libs folder. Again, you'll find that in your RackForms folder, app, move files, additional JS libs. Now, as soon as we have that, that library will appear in RackForms. And now whenever I save my job, and this is actually quite important, when I save that job, in my output forms job folder name, it'll actually be put in my JS folder. So again, the root of that folder was called Date Picker. And now we have indeed a folder called Date Picker, which has all the items in it. Now there's one other bit of setup then that we want to do, which is we want to create a RackForms include code.txt file. So here's the thing, when we have a JavaScript library like this, it's almost always going to have a series of includes that we want to put in the head block of our web page. And we can see that our date picker is no different. If I actually look at the source code for my date picker right here, we'll see that sure enough, in my head section right here, I have a selection of files that we're including. So I have, it looks like 2 style sheet files and a couple JavaScript files. So what we simply want to do is we want to take these includes right here, copy them, and then paste them into that RackForms include code page. Now, this is what it looks like right here, RackForms include code. And you'll notice then what I did is I simply copy and pasted that in there, and then I modified the path so that it works with what RackForms is creating. So this part's actually pretty important. Essentially what I'm saying here is that when we save this job, as we've done right here, output forms, custom calendar, it puts it in a folder called JS. So we need to make sure that we modify this path so that it looks in the JS folder and then the name of the extension. So JS date picker, and then we have our CSS and JavaScript folders. So that's what we have here. We have JS date picker, and then all the rest of the paths are the same. In other words, most of the time we just copy and paste what we have in whatever the example documentation is, and we just add JS / and then whatever we've called that folder to it. And then as soon as we have that, we're actually then going to have our path built for us. Now at this point then, the integration with RackForms is actually done. So I can actually go to my editor right here, I can save my job, and this, if I look at, for example, my Firebug right here, all of those files are actually being included. So I can actually look at my net tab right here, and I can see that my date picker CSS files are being included, jQuery is, my date picker JavaScript file itself, and so on. So this is good. The final step then is actually integrating this in with the rest of your code. And so usually when we have a module like this, it's actually going to include a bunch of sample code. So it'll say, hey, you want the most simple example, this is the code that you want. And there's really two things going on here. The first is the actual code itself, and then the second is any small tweaks that we might need to make in RackForms so that the code works seamlessly. So what I mean by that is the first thing I found when I started working with this particular plugin is that by default, it actually won't apply a date picker field to a text input field. It actually only applied this to a paragraph tag. And I actually found that out again by looking at the source code of the page and just seeing, oh, here's where the date picker is, and it's actually being applied to a p tag. So I actually had to go down and find that, oh, this is the code that I want to use if I want to use this with an input field. So I usually want to kind of investigate this code to find that. As soon as I found that was the case, then I basically took this code and I copied it, and I went into my, in this case, my JavaScript block, and I just pasted that code, make this a little bit bigger here, into my document.ready block right here. So I essentially pasted this code in. Unfortunately though, that wasn't quite it. So if we actually look at this in our editor right here, if I actually don't have a date in here, this library is a little bit buggy where it'll just put a bunch of nonsense values in here, just a bunch of not a number values. So this library actually requires that we have a valid date to begin with. So what I actually did then is I just did a really quick Google search here for how I create a current date in JavaScript, and I wrap this in a function call then. So basically I say the first thing I do is I'm going to set the date field equal to get today's date, and then that will ensure that whenever I run this form I actually get a valid date in here. And at this point it's probably not the best to have like 2015 in there if we're looking at birthdays, so we'd actually just put a value in there by hand if we wanted to, but at least it's something, and it's certainly not an error as we're getting otherwise. Again, this could be an error in the library itself, or maybe it's just an error in the way I've actually implemented it, but I do know that this works, so I'm actually okay with this. That said, there's maybe one other thing that we want to do, which is, again, this is actually pretty specific right here. Like, am I really going to remember to do all this the next time I actually load up this library? And there's a good chance I might not. So once again, this little code file right here is actually going to come to the rescue. So not only is this actually, again, a RackForms include code, not only is this actually including the JavaScript code, it will actually include any of this code as well. So if I don't want to have to remember to type that every time, I can literally just copy and paste this into my editor right here. And now, so long as I have a field called date right here, it will actually apply all of this code for me. So I don't even need this anymore. I can just get rid of that, and I know that this working code will do what I want. And I probably should make a note right here. So for example, field must be called date, just to kind of remember that for myself later on. But other than that, then I should now be able to save this file, and when I run this, the calendar code will still actually be applied to this field. Again, if we look at our source code for this page, we can actually see here that RackForms is including all of this for us. So it's basically just taking this file and it's just including it into the head code block of our page right here. So a nice handy way of doing that. So that's basically how we add custom extensions to RackForms. As a brief overview then, we had our file system work, which is essentially us needing to take whatever our downloaded file was and then putting it to the app move files additional JSLib folder as its own folder. Again, you'll notice when you get RackForms, you'll actually have a bunch of built-in items that we can use at a time. We usually want to create its own folder for it and then just take any of the contents of the download and drag and drop them into that folder. We'll then open up our RackForms include file, and by the way, if you don't have one, which you won't if you start fresh, you can use any of the other items right here as a template for it, or even just ideas for how it works. We would then essentially open that file up and then paste in any of the head code items that we want, in addition to any of the actual implementation code that we want. And now, so long as I have, again, a field called date in this case right here, and by the way, I should say that date is what this name value is right here, the field will just work. And so we actually have it. Of course, any questions about this or anything else you see in RackForms, please let us know at info@rackforms.com, and thanks for watching.